Hello and welcome to the State of Digital Clinical Trials podcast. My name is Manny Vasquez, and I am a Director of Strategy for Clinical Data here at Veeva Systems. And I'm really excited to be joined today by Trishna Baradia. So, Trishna, welcome to the podcast. So, for those of you out there who are not familiar with who Trishna is, I'm going to ask her to take a moment, maybe a couple moments, and introduce herself, give a little bit of background, and just color for us, some of your history and how you came to be where you are today.
Thanks, Manny. So I'm Trishna Baradia. I'm based in the UK, and I think it's usually easier to start from where I am now in terms of describing what I do and why I'm doing it. So I am the owner of the Spark Global, which is a patient engagement and advocacy consultancy. And I work with multiple stakeholders within healthcare and the life sciences. So that includes pharma, CROs, medcoms agencies, medical publishers, academia, professional bodies, patient organizations, digital health companies, like you name it. Basically to better embed the patient voice into healthcare and into research. So I work within therapy areas, so within specific disease areas, but also above therapy area as well. And when I'm working above therapy area, that's really wide ranging. Um, I've also, just to give you an idea, I said that I work within therapy areas. I've worked on projects in neuroscience, in oncology, in respiratory, in vaccines, that's just to name a few. I'm also a visiting lecturer in patient engagement at King's College London University at their Centre for Pharmaceutical Medicine Research. So I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis back in 2008. And that experience for me was actually very disempowering. I was essentially given this life-changing diagnosis, told that I had a lifelong neurological degenerative condition that currently has no cure. And I was just sent on my way. There was no signposting, there was no support in terms of where to go to for advice or information. Clinical trials weren't even mentioned as a potential option. This was at a time when patient centricity, patient centeredness, it was just sort of getting started. And I felt like, well, we had the opportunity to make sure that every person who is living with a condition or who is affected by a condition, because we can't forget caregivers as well, they should have an opportunity to be able to engage with the healthcare system, engage with industry, and have a good experience doing so. So it's all been very organic. As I said, from that diagnosis with MS back in 2008 to doing what I'm doing today, which is, full time in patient engagement, consultancy, and advocacy. And I feel like that diagnosis has kind of led me into what I was meant to do in life, really, which sounds really corny, but it is. I'm really passionate about what I do.
You mentioned three things that you tend to focus on specifically. It was the good patient engagement practice, DEI in healthcare and research, and the patient involvement in scientific publications. So I want to double click into those a little bit and maybe go another step deeper into, like, from a patient's perspective, like how and why are these three things specifically important? And why don't we start with a good patient engagement practice?
So patient centricity it's become a buzzword.
Mhm.
And I think what we need to make sure of is that the value of patient engagement, it continues to be recognized and acknowledged. And one of the ways that that can happen is if we're making sure that patient engagement is being done right. Um, from a patient's perspective, good patient engagement can lead into, better shared decision making in healthcare. It can lead to medicines getting to market faster. It can make clinical trials more suitable and appropriate for patients to participate in. So we also need to be making sure that the drugs that are being developed, which are very, very expensive, that the people that they're being developed for are actually taking them. But among people who are living with chronic illness, actually adherence rates are really poor. So making sure that we have good patient engagement strategies so that medicines development is patient focused, that can help to address this, because we need medicines to continue to be developed. It's not a one-way relationship. This is two-way. Industry needs patients need industry as well. And I think that there's lots of other drivers that are going on which are really sort of feeding into that. There's pressure coming from other stakeholders, regulators like the FDA, the EMA. They're starting to ask for evidence of patient involvement in drug development. They're taking into consideration patient preferences and insights when it comes to evaluating drugs and medical devices. Patients themselves are driving patient engagement forward. We've got more proactive patient groups. We've got patients who are better informed because we have access to more information. Patients are becoming more activated, and they're more likely to challenge poor healthcare. They're more likely to be involved in shared decision making. And that means when it comes to treatment selection, it's not only what the HCP thinks. I'll give you an example about how important early engagement is. So, and this is an example that's out there. It's out in the public domain. This was a science-driven development program, and it ultimately failed because patients weren't asked. So this development program was backed by basically some excellent science. In theory, inhaled insulin would completely remove the psychological barriers that are linked to subcutaneous injections of insulin. So things like needle phobia, incorrect injection technique. And it became the first inhaled insulin to be approved by the FDA, but it was then withdrawn from the market following poor sales. And the company actually said that it had poor acceptance by physicians and patients. Well, what was happening with the patients? If we look a bit deeper, we can see that actually some of the things which potentially could have been picked up had patients been involved, we could have avoided some of this. So, to start with, the inhaler was bulky. It was difficult to dismantle. It was awkward to move around. It was inconvenient. Patients didn't trust the route of administration. If you're using a syringe, you know that exactly how much insulin you're getting. Whereas, if you're inhaling, people aren't necessarily going to be sure how much is actually going into the body. Looking back, when you look at something like that as a case study, you think, well, if patients had been involved right from the beginning, could that have been a different story? And this is where I really feel that we need to be still doing much better. We need to be talking to patients much earlier. And that's in the setting of research priorities, looking at things like target product profiles, the clinical trial design, the logistics around sites, even things like the what tools or technology is potentially going to be used within the trial. So I think thinking about all of these things is what we really need to still be doing much better. And like I said, early, consistent, sort of throughout the whole life cycle of a product.
Yeah, there's a lot. So there's a lot in there to unpack, and there was a couple pieces that I wanted to tug on a little bit that you mentioned. One is there's a lot of things that the sponsor needs to start considering doing if they're not doing it already in terms of engaging with patients early. And we have, this conversation. I have a lot of conversations with sponsors around, you mentioned patient centricity as a buzzword. It's also kind of shifted over now to site centricity is also a kind of newer buzzword. And I'm finding that more or less they kind of run hand in hand. You don't get one without the other.
Yeah.
But a lot of sponsors, it seems, that don't already have some type of program in place. Generally the larger ones tend to do. They have, departments of people that are dedicated to, figuring out their site and patient strategy. But some of the smaller ones, they're kind of flying by the seat of their pants. They only have enough funding for, this program that they're about to go into. They don't necessarily know where to start. And they say, well, I should be talking to my sites, I should be talking to my patients, but I can't talk to all of them. Who do I start with? Where do I start? So in terms of, good patient engagement practices, what would your advice be to a sponsor who's just starting to think about these things? Maybe they're just going to go into the clinic now. What are some good strategies that they can take and deploy to, engage with patients more effectively?
So one thing I would say is that you have to think about what are the questions that you're asking, what is it that you actually want to know, and what is your objective of talking to patients, because sometimes it's not necessary to talk to every single patient, and that's just impractical anyway. And so you have to think about, well, what is it that I'm trying to achieve, and then what method of engagement would best suit that objective. So, for instance, would it be sending out a survey where you could get a huge, much wider range of views, send it out to lots more people? Would it be potentially an advisory board or focus group? Are you better off doing, say, one-on-one interviews with a few select representatives of that patient community? I think that's really drilling down and thinking, well, what is it that I'm trying to achieve, and what's the best method? I think that's something which often isn't thought about enough. I see, people saying, okay, we need to talk to some patients. Okay, let's hold an advisory board. Even though actually that might not be the best method for what you're actually trying to achieve on that occasion. So I think determining that, I think also not being scared of just making a start, because I think sometimes it's much easier to say, well, actually, I don't know how to do this, don't know where to start, don't know where to look for patients, don't know where to begin. Well, actually, it's much easier to not do anything. And then you have to ask yourself, well, is that the right thing to do? Is it ethical? Is this the right thing to do for the trial? Actually, most of the time, the answer will be no, it's not. So even if it means making a start, but then also being very transparent with, say, for example, the patients that you're working with, and saying, look, we're learning as well, then that can help with the experience, because if patients are aware that, okay, things might not always go right, that it might be that processes aren't in place, contracting might take a while, even things around how to work with patients around things like flexibility, the language that's used, making sure that not there's loads of scientific terminology, accessibility questions, all of that kind of thing. If patients know that actually this is a learning curve for the organization, then you will find that they're going to be understanding. The other thing that I often hear is, oh, we don't have enough time and we don't have enough financial resources. And for both of those, I always say, the length of time it takes to develop a drug or to run a clinical trial, and the amount of money it takes to do that, patient engagement is a drop in the ocean. in the grand scheme of things. So that for me actually that's not a good enough reason not to be doing patient engagement. And the returns that you will get are going to far outweigh what you have to put in terms of time and financial investment. Because there's research out there which shows that, you know, clinical trials that have been designed with patients in mind are faster to recruit, they have better retention, the drugs are more likely to come to market faster.
So you already touched on one challenge that we had previously discussed. So I wanted to just pivot into that question. You know, getting patients involved in the design of trials early enough, that was certainly one of them. What are some of the other top challenges that you're seeing within the R&D space for patient engagement?
So I think contracting is still a bit of a, let's say, challenging process sometimes. There's some great plain language templates out there, but I'm not seeing enough organizations using them. And I think, you know, we're at a point now where generally contracting shouldn't be as much of an issue as sometimes it is. I think diversity of voice, we have to make sure that there is equitable opportunity for people who are affected by illness to get involved and, you know, be able to feed into clinical trial design. This is where you're talking about equitable sort of patient engagement practices. So things like being flexible about the way you work. If you're going to hold, let's say you're going to hold an advisory board, offer in person or virtual, find out what will work best and what will work best for the people that you want to get involved. You need to define what does diverse mean for your particular patient community. You might need to provide some training. You might need to make sure that that you've got alternative language translation available. You might need to make sure that the time that you hold the advisory board is at a time when it doesn't, for instance, exclude people who are working or who might have children that they need to look after, or, you know, all those kind of life commitments. Those are the kinds of things which can essentially make or break whether somebody is able to you know, take part in these opportunities. We've spoken about early patient engagement. I also think right at the other end of the medicines development timeline, we're starting to get the emergence of patient involvement in publications, but that's very much a developing area. And patient involvement in publications, when it comes to company-sponsored publications, there's still a lot of discussions around how can that happen, what are the processes that are needed, how can we make sure that it's equitable, because publication space is particularly a very, very traditional space. You know, it's usually been healthcare professionals, researchers, academics who are involved. And so actually, if you've had patients involved in the clinical trial design, then they could potentially meet authorship criteria. The International Council of Medical Journal Editors, their criteria for authorship, the first criteria is that an author has to have been involved in the concept or the design of the research. So if you've had patients involved in the design of the clinical trial, in like the protocol development, etc., then they could potentially be involved in a publication at the end. But what can happen is that by the time it actually gets to the publication stage, sometimes the publication team doesn't even realize that patients were even involved in the clinical trial design, because within a company, this, let's say the product is handed from one department to another. And by the time it gets to that point, often, like I said, people aren't aware. So, and that's an area which I'm actually really interested in.
Going back to one of the things you had mentioned when you said you were first diagnosed, and I think this is a common problem that we hear throughout the patient space, as one of the larger challenges is not just access to trials, but just awareness that any trials are going on. And so curious in your work where you're seeing this being addressed, and what's going on within the patient advocacy community to help build awareness of clinical trials and where to go find them, and help patients find that needle in the haystack that they might need.
Yeah, so I'd like to say that it's got better, but yes, it's improving. We're not there yet. Um, Awareness of clinical trials is still an issue,
Mhm.
and partly because most patients, their awareness of clinical trials will come from their healthcare professional. So if they are under a doctor who is involved in research, who is potentially at a teaching hospital, who is, at a research center, they will hear about research, the trials that are going on. If you're not, then you may never be made aware. There's also sometimes some assumptions that are made by healthcare professionals as to who would be interested in clinical trials. And so sometimes, people won't even mention it because they think, oh, that patient's not going to be interested. And so I think that we need to move away from the healthcare, the HCP being the only sort of source of information about clinical trials. And we have that potential because there are so many sources of information out there now. So patient groups, now some are listing clinical trials and research studies on their websites. That can help potentially to build trust in the healthcare, sort of the healthcare ecosystem, and also in pharma, because we know that trust in pharma can be an issue. And I think it's also about looking or going to places that you wouldn't necessarily think about. There's an organization in the US, again, I can't remember the exact abbreviation, multi-regional, I think it's the MRCT. I think that's the order of the letters. And they've got a brilliant glossary of terms which are used in clinical trials, clinical research. And in that glossary, they provide lay language definitions and explanations and alternatives. There's a project that I'm working on with an organization called Fuse, and that's
Mhm.
PHUSE, and it's non-profit. It's all about health, about data science, and this project that we're working on is all around raising awareness about clinical trial data. So how is it collected? Why is it collected? Data transparency. What happens to a piece of data throughout the clinical trial process? And within this project, we've created infographics, we've created videos. And again, it's not attached to any one specific trial. This is just general education about what goes on during a clinical trial, what are the kinds of questions people might have, and trying to answer those so that people just have a better basic understanding of the clinical research process.
So I wanted to come back to some of the comments you had made around, people that the people their drugs are developed for actually taking them. You made a couple comments that kind of lean into this idea that we've heard talked about, in more recent years. We had DCTs for a while, decentralized clinical trials. We kind of got over the hype cycle of those, and we've kind of moved on now. Pragmatic design, pragmatic trial design is something that we talk about a lot. And you had mentioned a couple things that I think lean into that conversation. And also, the last gentleman that I had an opportunity to do a podcast with, his name's Brad Hightower, and
Oh
he's a site
yes,
owner.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah. Oh yeah.
he's a site owner here in the U.S. and I asked him a question, which you'll get the same question towards the end here. But one of the things that he had mentioned is I think his response had to do with wanting the inclusion exclusion criteria of trials to be more in line with the actual patients that that have these these diseases. And I think that also kind of lends itself to the idea of pragmatic trial design. So I want to put that question to you: is what in your your current role, your current day to day, are you having discussions around how sponsors can better design their trials to be more pragmatic, and how do they go about making that shift?
Yeah, short answer is yes, those discussions are happening, and particularly the inclusion exclusion criteria. Something which is, I think, really important to remember is that that also feeds into diversity, equity, and inclusion, because there's some exclusion criteria that automatically starts to exclude certain sections of the population because of either some comorbidities are more prevalent in certain sections of the population. You might have certain sections of the population that naturally have a higher body mass index than others, or lower BMI. And so that inclusion exclusion criteria, I think, yes, we obviously need to make sure that the clinical trials are going to be robust, but we all do need to be practical about these things. And I think sponsors are starting to understand this more. And when we're having conversations and I'm in discussions around the design of clinical trials, often what will happen is, we'll be in an advisory board, for instance, and this potential protocol is being presented to a group of patients, and patients will think of things that the sponsor hasn't even thought of. I remember there was one conversation. It was around a trial that had already been designed. It was already running, and they noticed that. So this trial was running for quite a while, and they noticed that come sort of the winter time, the the attendance rate for site visits started to drop. And it wasn't until they started to talk to patients that they realized that, so within this patient population, mobility was an issue. And people weren't attending the site because in order to get to the entrance, they had to cross a car park. Well, when the weather was really cold and the car park iced over, they were scared of falling. And so things like that, where, those are things that as patients we will often think about, but actually a sponsor just might not. There's another example which I absolutely love. I heard about this on it was on another webinar, and it was a medicine that was actually the trial was run and the medicine got approved. It was a medicine for spasticity. And so this medicine was administered via a puffer into the mouth. It was administered during the clinical trial. It was administered on site by a nurse. And the way that the drug worked, the mechanism of action was it was absorbed through the mucosa in the mouth. So it had to be administered in a specific place within the mouth in order for it to be absorbed. The trial went really well. The treatment was licensed, and doctors started to prescribe it. After a while, the company realized that doctors weren't prescribing it. And so they started to ask the doctors, well, why? And doctors were telling them that patients were saying that they weren't convinced that this drug was working. And it was just like, well, but the clinical trial showed that it worked, what's happening. So, they undertook an ethnography study, and what they found was that if you've got patients who've been treated for spasticity, then their motor skills aren't going to be necessarily very good. And in the trial, they were going to the site and the nurse was administering this medication with the puffer, which involved having to use your hands. In real life, it was the patients who were doing this, and they were doing it at home. But given their spasticity issues, they weren't actually able to operate the puffer very well. And so they weren't necessarily expelling the full dose. And it was often mishitting the target. It was, I think, falling on their teeth and not in the mucosa. So it wasn't being absorbed. So it wasn't that the treatment wasn't effective, because the trial showed that it was. It was that nobody had thought that in real life, how would this actually work? And so they ended up having to pull the treatment from the market. They redesigned it, this time with patient input. But I mean, just think about if this had actually happened like all the way back when they were, designing the product, but also then the trial, some of these things might have been picked up. Because like I said, patients think about things which just don't even cross other people's minds, because this is the everyday for somebody who's living with a condition. I think the other thing that we have to take into consideration, which I always find incredibly interesting, is when I'm working on projects where you have international representation, and some of the things that people think about when they're from different geographic locations, because of, for instance, their environment, what is accessible to them, etc., is completely different. So somebody, for instance, I was talking to a patient advocate who is in India. They don't live in a city. They live in a small rural area. And one of the things that she has to think about is how to dispose of her medication. So if you've got a medication, for instance, that has to be delivered by injections, how does she dispose of those syringes? Because they don't have an infrastructure which necessarily allows her to be able to, for instance, get rid of them in a sharps bin and somebody comes and collects it, which is what happens. I was on injections for quite a while, and I would put it in my sharps bin and I could go and drop it off at my doctor's surgery or to the local hospital or the pharmacy, or somebody would come and pick it up. There was an infrastructure there. But if you're living in a place where you don't even have an infrastructure for, regular garbage collection, those are the kinds of things that, people are thinking about according to their particular circumstances. And this is why, again, I think that diversity of voice becomes really important, because these, many of the drugs that are being developed, they're being developed and hopefully are going to be, we want them to be accessible to everyone who needs it. And so we have to make sure that, these questions are being taken into account, and if necessary localization is taking place. That goes for the same when it comes to the clinical trial design. If you design a trial, the way that it operates in, say, for instance, the UK, might look very different to the way that it can operate in somewhere in, I don't know, somewhere in Latin America or somewhere in Africa, for instance. So yeah, that localization, I think, it becomes very important. And I think that sort of delving deeper is something that we need to be doing.
One last question for you. It's the one I alluded to earlier, that Brad's response. So this is the question that everyone gets asked at the end of these podcasts, and it's the magic wand question. And the question is, if you had a magic wand and you had the opportunity to do away with one thing that you currently have to do today that you can, consign to the dustbin of history tomorrow and never have to do it again, and one thing that you could just fix where tomorrow you can't do it today, but you would then be able to do it from tomorrow on, what would those two things be?
So, firstly, I've always wanted a magic wand. I'm just going to say that. um, so I think the one thing that I would make sort of disappear is the word can't. So
Mhm.
I think we need to get more people thinking about how we can, rather than immediately thinking something is too difficult, too expensive, too resource intensive. They don't know how to. Legal and compliance will say no. All the other reasons people often say as to why patient engagement isn't being done. So I think it's a change in mindset from, immediately thinking, oh, we can't do that, to how can we make this happen? So I think, yeah, the one thing that I would make disappear is the word can't. One thing that I would fix is it would be equitable access to healthcare and treatment. Um, I don't think a patient's outcome should be influenced by where they live, what their income is, how well they speak that country's language, what their health literacy is like. I think if we had a way we were able to achieve equitable access to healthcare and treatment, then we'd really see what the power of modern medicine is in action. Because right now we don't have equitable access to healthcare and treatment. And so is modern medicine really achieving its true potential? I'll leave that just there hanging.
Those were great. Those are great, great answers. So, Trishna, thank you so much for your time today. If someone in the audience would like to get in touch with you, how do they find you out on the interweb?
So they can find me on LinkedIn, on Instagram. I'm also on Twitter or X. But yeah, LinkedIn is usually the best place.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And then we'll probably put some of your LinkedIn information we could put on the screen here for folks to reference. And if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, we hope that you'll continue to join us for the next one, which will be coming in 2025 in season 4. For now, my name is Manny Vasquez, and thank you for joining us.